My name's Jeff Brighty, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to be in conversation with conservationist and filmmaker Joe Ruxton to talk about the story of the multi-award winning film A Plastic Ocean. So welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here.
So just before we start just going over that story, I just want to make sure everybody has a sense of kind of who you are and what you've been doing up until the point of working with A Plastic Ocean and the film. So Jo is a passionate campaigner for the environment, and she first started doing her conservation work in Hong Kong for WWF, and particularly looking at the marine parks out there in Hong Kong. In 1997, she was very much part of the original Blue Planet film series that was done by the BBC, producing and directing underwater sequences as the BBC's dive team lead. Since that experience, Jo has moved on to work to become an independent filmmaker and started the foundation, which we now know as Plastic Oceans UK, Plastic Oceans Foundation originally, to really highlight the issue around plastics and pollution in the marine environment. So very much central to the Blue Hope campaign we're looking at today. And as part of that, really the central activity that drove Jo forward was very much making this film A Plastic Ocean. So Jo, we've got the film coming up in about 20 minutes. So this is an opportunity really just to set the scene really for what was happening in advance of making the film, and obviously how long it took and the stories. So let's just sort of go back to the very beginning really, and kind of what was behind, what made you decide to make A Plastic Ocean in the first place?
Well, I've been at the BBC for 12 years, making mostly underwater documentaries. And during that time, obviously got to dive in some amazing places. But what I was seeing there and what was being shown on the screen was very different. Yes, there was incredible wildlife. Some of the waters were pristine, but there were huge problems, and plastic was one of them. And yet we continued to show the oceans as if there was no problems. And I felt that we had a duty really to tell it how it is, because if people perceive the oceans to be so full of life and so clean without any issues, then they would feel fine about continuing to extract as much as they can out of them and continue to throw effluents and all sorts of trash into them. So I did take the conservation ideas to the BBC at the time, but it was always a case of, well, people don't want to know about bad news. You know, this is about entertaining. And I understand that, but I still felt that we should at least give them the opportunity to care about it and to learn what was happening. And so I did decide to leave and to do my own story. And choosing a topic was difficult, but the plastics one, to me, it was something that was increasing. And it just dawned on me that we were in this mess because of this notion that we'd been told that plastic was disposable. And that was crazy, because plastic, out of all the products we use, is the one thing that is designed not to be disposable. You know, it doesn't break down, it doesn't decompose in nature. It might break up, but it doesn't go away. And yet, you know, it was so much part of our lifestyle to have all these disposable items. And so I thought, well, if I can get a film out about that, show what's happening, then we'd have some kind of chance of getting people on board with a movement to address it.
So how did you start? How did you start making a film?
Well, it's interesting actually. I'd been told, I was in Hong Kong doing another film actually about shark finning, and met up with somebody there. And he told me about this Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and it triggered something in my mind. But then I started to look into it, and it was described to be this giant continent of plastic forming out in the Pacific Ocean, where the currents eventually meet and dump anything that they've picked up from our coastlines. And I looked at it, and they were saying it was 10 meters deep. It was twice the size of Texas, 3 times the size of Spain. And I thought, well, I've got to see some pictures of it. But all the pictures I saw just looked like river mouths. And might have a little tiny wooden canoe in there with one person in it surrounded by all this plastic. And I thought, well, that can't be real. And the other thing that dawned on me is, you know, we've got this permanent space station up there with astronauts sending back the pictures of the planet. Why is there nothing about this massive, you know, 3,000-mile continent of plastic? So the first thing I did in 2010 was to get a place on an expedition that was going out there with Ocean Voyages. And I went out from San Francisco and we spent a month. And that was the real eye-opener for me, because the problem isn't a big floating island of trash. It would almost be easier to deal with if it was, but we couldn't see the plastic from the surface, apart from occasional fishing nets and floating crates. Nothing like this big continent. But from 400 miles west of San Francisco, we were trawling for plankton. And the plankton net, the closer we got to the center, was getting really, really choked up with microplastics. And these are ones that have probably come from bigger plastics. But in plastic, seeming like it goes away, it actually becomes brittle and just keeps breaking up and breaking up and breaking up. And that was getting into the food chain, because we could see from the plankton that we were collecting as well that they were eating it. And that was a real sort of dawning for me, because I had to actually think about, how do I make this film? How do I make plankton nets interesting to the general public? Because I also learnt on that voyage about the chemicals associated with plastic and how they have been linked to all kinds of critical disease. So thinking about a radio show, and then I thought, no, we can bring charismatic animals into this. And I thought, of course, the most charismatic of all sea creatures is the blue whale, and they feed on plankton. So that's how it started.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned the crews, and obviously there are scientists within, you know, the film, and obviously science evidence is critical to telling the story. But the story has, you know, the film has many memorable scenes within it, having watched it a good few times now. And I'm just wondering, you know, apart from the hard-edged science and the evidence that you were bringing to light and communicating to people, kind of what touched you the most? What tugged at your heartstrings in telling this story of plastic pollution in our ocean?
Firstly was the realization that this habit of ours was causing such an issue in the marine environment. I couldn't believe, you know, looking down on this beautiful blue Pacific, the color of the screen behind me, you know, it just looked so gorgeous, and that this was full of plastic. So that was one thing. The other one was, which you'll see, that those who are going to watch the film, is a shearwater chick, an 80-day-old shearwater chick. In fact, we collected 10 that had died on the beach, and opening them up and seeing how much plastic was inside their distended stomachs. And that was so sad. But the other thing, I think, was being in Tuvalu and meeting the families there that are just drowning under plastic waste. And, you know, you can hear about these problems, you can hear about people being affected by it. But when you're taken into their homes and you meet their children and they serve you food, and it just becomes so real what these people are facing. And it was almost like having a bit of a premonition when I was there, because I thought, well, if you imagine Tuvalu as a representative of all the landmass on the planet, it was like looking into our future if we don't do something about this. And we really have to, because we're only a decade or two behind what's happening there. You know, this is increasing in our environment all the time. I live in Cornwall, and the beaches, of course, have been closed to tourists. And all the time when my family and I, we've taken exercise on the beach, we've been struck by how beautifully clean they are. And now that people are coming back to visit, they'll travel a long way. But what's being left is all the trash on the beach, you know, all the plastic bottles, crisp packets, disposable barbecues. And you think people come here to see this and be part of this pristine environment, but don't even think about what's being left. And that's an attitude we really have to change. And that's what a lot of the work is at Plastic Oceans UK with our education program.
And we've seen in the recent COVID pandemic, you know, a change of plastic pollution from plastic cups and straws and things like that, moving to, you know, masks and gloves. And we've seen this on the beaches. And in fact, even, you know, Hong Kong, for example, like the photographs that have come from campaigners there has shown the beaches are absolutely full of this material getting washed out because people are putting down their toilets. So,
Yeah.
so in terms of your filming back over the period of sort of 2010 to 2015 when you were doing the filming, what were the particular challenges that you faced? Because at that stage, really, no one had an appreciation of this story. People are kind of aware now, but what were some of the challenges that you faced in bringing this story to a cinematic place?
Well, for me, it was quite difficult to stop filming and to stop with all the new stories that were coming in. But by then we had quite a big team. I mean, I'd worked for 2 years before we actually started filming, but even then, with my background of storytelling, it was very much natural history, as it happens. And we needed the film to go to a much broader audience and create a story that would engage those that aren't already interested in the subject. And we approached Adam Leipzig, who had done March of the Penguins, and asked if he would help us to bring the story forward, to change it from a natural history documentary to a film that would engage a much wider audience. And that's what happened at the end. We had most of the sequences shot, but that was, for me, that was one of the hard bits, was trying to turn it into a story. It was an 8-year project.
And like many films, of course, there's an awful lot of footage that's taken that's never actually seen the light of day. So, how did you decide what to bring into the final cut, as it were, as opposed to some of the other compelling stories that no doubt you're able to tell on plastic pollution elsewhere in the world?
It's always, whenever you make a film, particularly one of anything that's sort of more than 40 minutes, and even the shorter ones, there's always footage that will be shot that doesn't get used. It's very rare that sequences don't get dropped. One of the ones that sticks out for me that was dropped because it just didn't fit with the rest of the storyline was one about a snapping turtle that was found in the Mississippi, and when she was a hatchling, she'd gone into the ring from the top of a drinks bottle, and her whole shell it got stuck around the middle of her shell, so she's ended up as a turtle that's shaped like a figure of 8 with a tiny little waist, and she'd survived. By the time we filmed her, I think she was it was 12 years after she was rescued, but even though that footage wasn't used in the film, it's been very much part of the lectures and presentations that I do with schools and other interested parties. So I think there's an awful lot more that can be used, but that's always the same. The original Blue Planet series, for example, was 8 hours in total, but we had 3,500 hours of footage for that series. So, and it's probably even more now, because half of that was done on film. So you've got to be very careful with what you shoot. Whereas with digital, it's very easy to, even some cameramen just leave the camera running when they're underwater, and you can't do that with film. So I'm sure the Blue Planet 2 would have had an awful lot more.
Yeah. So the film was released in 2017. It's been on web-based platforms. It's been shown in cinemas. It's been shown in countries all around the world. It's been, and obviously it's reached a huge audience and received a good number of awards. I think it's over 15 awards now have been the film's received. So, and in terms of the impact of the film, therefore, and what you're now doing with Plastic Oceans UK as a charity, how is that work continuing? Because demonstrably we can still see plastic pollution in our environment. So what Plastic Ocean is doing now on the back of the film?
Well, it's quite interesting how the film became such a tool for change. When we started this, it's 11 years ago, nobody was talking about plastic. It wasn't on the agenda. And even though I approached other NGOs, other than doing beach cleanups, nobody was actually tackling the other end of it. I don't feel that you can keep cleaning up all the time. And there weren't plastic bag bans or anything like that. So what's happened is it's become sort of a household issue. People talk about it, people understand about it. Yes, there's always people that will continue not to make any changes, but I think an awful lot's been done. But yes, there still is more to do, and certainly the work that we're doing with Plastic Oceans UK is looking at how to get children plastic intelligent so that by the time they leave school, they understand what plastic is, why it's an amazing material, why it can be so dangerous in the environment, but also how important our oceans are as a life support system for every single one of us. You know, everything on the planet depends on the ocean. And that's very much part of the work that we're doing going forward.
And today, Sir David has lent his support to the Blue Hope campaign. I know he's been a very strong supporter of what you've been doing and the Plastic Oceans movement moving forward. But obviously today is World Oceans Day, isn't it? So it is about how we celebrate the ocean and all it is doing for us. So, and I asked this of Paul Rose about an hour or so ago about what is it that we can look forward to over the decade of the oceans, which starts in 2021, and your hope for what we want to see happen in that period, so that we are therefore protecting and using our oceans sustainably going forward. So what are your thoughts, Joe, about how we go forward from now on to protect and improve our oceans?
Well, the very fact that the UN has called the next decade the decade of the oceans, I think is a massive step forward. The oceans have always taken second place in any conservation work. It's only people who have actually taken the time to study the oceans after school that become so passionate about them, unless you live very close to them, and then often you take them for granted. So it does give me a lot of hope that it is firmly on the agenda, and it's firmly on government agendas too, because I think people really realise just how important it is that we protect the oceans. The changes I've seen over the last 10 years, the changes in behaviour, the alternatives that are coming forward, and certainly the work I do with schools, the children are so engaged in this topic and cannot believe we've got into this situation. I honestly have so much hope for the future now, but we do have to stop treating the oceans as a trash can. I'm aware of the time, yeah, the film's going to be starting soon.
Indeed. So thank you very much, Joe, for giving us your perspectives on the film. I hope everyone enjoys the film. There's some hard elements in it, but it's about really what we should be doing to protect and improve the oceans, particularly today on World Oceans Day. So thanks, ADEX. Thanks to the sponsors for the Blue Hope campaign, and enjoy the film. And we look forward to comments coming through over the next few minutes and hours on Facebook. Thank you.
And my thanks as well to all our sponsors.